Welcome. I'm Rusty, a private investigator. Join me on Truth in Shadows as we embark on a journey to uncover the truth together. Let's dive into the mysterious and expose the hidden realities. The hidden truth behind Ibarra's crime. On the morning of February 22nd, 2024, the University of Georgia campus in Athens became the site of a tragedy that would haunt the community for months to come. Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student with a bright future, had gone for her usual morning run. Little did she know, it would be the last time she would ever set foot on that path. The news of her brutal murder spread rapidly across local and national media outlets. Initial reports confirmed the grim details. Laken had been violently attacked while running near a secluded area of the campus. The killer, later identified as Jose Antonio Ibarra, a 26-year-old Venezuelan national, had approached Laken from behind, strangled her, and then struck her repeatedly with a large rock. The brutality of the crime left the community in shock. The media was quick to cover the horrifying details of the incident. News channels aired breaking stories throughout the day, with reports focusing on the details of the attack and the victim's identity. Local newspapers and national outlets alike ran headlines that painted a chilling picture of the crime, with phrases like "Campus murder shocks Georgia community" and "Brutal attack leaves student dead in seemingly safe area." As the story spread, it became clear that this was no ordinary crime. It was a senseless act of violence that had shattered a once peaceful university town. Laken's death quickly became a symbol of vulnerability, especially for students who often felt secure on their campuses. The murder sparked a wave of emotional responses, with social media platforms flooded by tributes to Laken and calls for justice. Within hours of the news breaking, hashtags like #JusticeForLaken and #CampusSafety began trending on Twitter, as students and alumni alike rallied behind the tragic loss. The media's coverage of the crime highlighted the shocking vulnerability of university students. Television reporters emphasized that what was once a safe and familiar space for students to run, study, and socialize had now become the backdrop for a brutal murder. It was an unsettling realization for everyone. If such a crime could happen on a college campus, it could happen anywhere. Family members, friends, and professors of Laken were interviewed, providing heartfelt reflections on her life and the profound loss they felt. Her mother, overcome with grief, spoke to reporters about her daughter's dreams and the hole her passing had left in their lives. She was just starting her journey, Laken's mother said, struggling to hold back tears. She had so much to give, and now she's gone. It's not just a loss for us, it's a loss for everyone who knew her. As the investigation began, local law enforcement worked tirelessly to uncover the details of the crime. They quickly confirmed that Laken had been the victim of a brutal attack, but the question remained: who was responsible for taking her life and why? Within hours, the investigation shifted into full gear, with detectives combing through the crime scene, gathering evidence and interviewing potential witnesses. At this point, there was little information about the killer, but authorities were determined to find the person who had taken Laken's life. As police launched their search, news outlets quickly expanded their coverage. CNN, the New York Times, and other major publications picked up the story, with national networks broadcasting updates on the investigation. Media outlets also reported on the public's growing concern over campus safety, with many students demanding changes to ensure that something like this could never happen again. Meanwhile, the focus of the media began to shift. As the search for the killer intensified, so did the coverage of Laken's life. Reporters spoke to those who knew her best, her friends, professors, and fellow students, painting a picture of a young woman who was dedicated to her studies, passionate about helping others, and had a bright future ahead of her. Laken's death was not just a tragedy for her family, but for everyone who had known her. It was a loss that left a gaping hole in the hearts of many. Despite the overwhelming sadness, the press began to shift toward questions of justice. How could a seemingly safe college campus become the site of such a violent crime? How could someone like Laken, who had so much to give, become the victim of such a brutal attack? With these questions hanging in the air, the public waited for answers. Meanwhile, as the investigation continued, police officials confirmed that they had several leads to follow. The media outlets, now in full investigative mode, began discussing potential suspects, theories, and the timeline of the crime. Rumors swirled about the identity of the killer, but law enforcement remained tight-lipped, carefully crafting their approach to ensure the investigation was thorough and not compromised. What had initially been reported as a random act of violence quickly evolved into something much more complex. It was revealed that the suspect, Jose Antonio Ibarra, had a history of encounters with law enforcement. His criminal record included charges for shoplifting, endangering minors, and other minor offenses, though he had never been held accountable to the full extent of the law. As more information about Ibarra came to light, it became clear that the case wasn't as straightforward as it had initially seemed. He was not just a stranger. He was someone who had been overlooked by the legal system time and time again, raising troubling questions about systemic failures. The media's tone shifted again, as national discussions about immigration, law enforcement, and public safety took center stage. Ibarra's immigration status, his prior run-ins with the law, and his apparent lack of accountability sparked debates across the country. Could this tragedy have been avoided? Many argued that the failures of the system had allowed someone like Ibarra to slip through the cracks, creating a sense of outrage that reverberated through the media, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike. With Ibarra still on the run, the investigation intensified, and the media's focus moved from the murder itself to the ongoing manhunt. News outlets tracked the search, broadcasting live updates as law enforcement combed through neighborhoods and checked possible hideouts. While Ibarra remained at large, the pressure mounted for authorities to bring him to justice quickly. The media continued to report on the growing public unrest, with some calling for tougher immigration laws and a more rigorous system to deal with repeat offenders. Others were concerned about the security measures at the university, calling for better surveillance and greater protections for students. In the wake of the tragedy, the community rallied together, but the search for answers and justice was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the public would learn that justice would not come easily. But the case of Laken Riley had already begun to shift the conversation about safety, immigration, and the failures of the justice system. As the investigation pressed on, the media's role in holding authorities accountable and in keeping the memory of Laken alive remained central to the ongoing story. The case of Laken Riley. Laken Riley, the victim's life, legacy, and character. The tragic murder of Laken Riley not only shocked the University of Georgia community, but also struck at the heart of the values that many held dear in her memory. She was not just a victim, but a young woman whose life had promised so much and whose potential had been ruthlessly snuffed out. Her story was not just one of violence and sorrow, but one that highlighted the stark contrast between a life full of hope and the brutal, senseless act that took it away. Laken Riley was a person whose character stood out among her peers. Known for her kindness, intelligence, and dedication, she was a rising star in the nursing program at the University of Georgia. She had a dream to help others, to heal, and to make a difference. But beyond her academic achievements, it was her personal connections, her love for others, and her infectious positivity that defined her life. Friends, classmates, and professors all speak of her with a warmth that transcends the pain of her untimely death. She was always there for everyone, said one of her classmates, a fellow nursing student. You could always count on her, whether it was for advice on school or just to brighten your day with her smile. Laken's empathy and compassion were evident in every interaction. She was not just pursuing a degree in nursing, she was living it every day. Laken volunteered at local hospitals and clinics, giving her time to those in need. In class, she was known as the one who would step in to help her classmates when they struggled. It was not unusual to see her patiently explain difficult concepts to others, always with a smile and an encouraging word. Born and raised in Athens, Georgia, Laken had deep ties to the community. She had always been drawn to the healthcare field, and it was clear from a young age that she wanted to dedicate her life to helping others. Her parents, both of whom were involved in public service, instilled in her the values of compassion and responsibility. They often described her as someone who always put others first, someone who was determined to make a positive impact. She was the kind of person who would stop what she was doing just to help someone else, said her mother, her voice breaking with emotion. She had a heart that was bigger than anyone I know. Her friends and family paint a picture of someone who was full of life. She loved spending time outdoors, hiking and running, and she often spoke about her dreams of becoming a nurse practitioner and working with underserved communities. Laken was deeply involved in her school's community and was admired for her leadership skills, her academic dedication, and her ability to bring people together. Laken's tragic death left a void not just in her family, but in the lives of everyone who knew her. For those who had seen her grow up, the loss was especially devastating. "She was going to change the world," said her father, his eyes red from crying. "It's heartbreaking to know that her story ended like this, but we want to make sure her legacy lives on." In the wake of her death, Laken's family became fierce advocates for justice, vowing to ensure that her killer would not escape the consequences of his actions. But more than that, they wanted her story to inspire change, to be a reminder of the need for safer campuses and a stronger system of justice. The investigation, finding justice for Laken. As the media frenzy grew around Laken's death, the investigation into her murder was already underway. Law enforcement agencies, both local and state, were working tirelessly to uncover the truth behind the brutal crime. The details of the murder were horrifying, but what followed was a systematic investigation that would reveal the dark truth about the man who had taken Laken's life. Forensic teams were immediately called to the scene. The initial examination of Laken's body revealed the violent nature of her death. She had been strangled, and the evidence indicated that the attacker had used a large rock to inflict fatal blows to her head. The forensic team meticulously gathered evidence from the crime scene, including DNA samples, fingerprints, and other materials that would help identify the killer. The forensic evidence would soon prove crucial in identifying the murderer, but it was the surveillance footage that provided the first major breakthrough in the case. Investigators obtained footage from nearby cameras that captured the final moments of Laken's life. The footage showed a man, later identified as Jose Antonio Ibarra, approaching her from behind as she jogged along the path. The footage was grainy, but the figure of the man was unmistakable, and authorities quickly began working to track down his identity. Over the next few days, law enforcement intensified their search. Interviews with witnesses and Laken's friends and family helped investigators build a clearer picture of the events leading up to the murder. While the suspect's identity remained unknown, investigators were able to connect the dots between the crime scene and Ibarra's background. As the days passed, more details emerged about Ibarra's criminal history. It was revealed that he had entered the United States illegally and had been arrested multiple times for minor offenses, including shoplifting and endangering minors. These prior encounters with law enforcement should have raised red flags, but Ibarra had always managed to avoid serious legal consequences. His immigration status also raised questions about how someone with such a history had been allowed to remain in the country without facing deportation. The revelation of Ibarra's past only deepened the public's outrage. How could someone with such a violent history have been free to roam the streets? The media, which had already been following the case closely, now began to focus on the systemic failures that allowed Ibarra to remain at large. Reports of his criminal record and illegal status were met with outrage from local officials and the public. As investigators continued their search, the media coverage grew more intense, with calls for stronger immigration enforcement and more effective policing to prevent similar tragedies. But even as the case seemed to gain momentum, Ibarra remained elusive. Authorities worked around the clock, tracking down leads and scouring the area for any sign of the killer. It wasn't until several days later that a tip led them to a remote area, where Ibarra was finally captured without resistance. The manhunt and capture of Jose Antonio Ibarra. Jose Antonio Ibarra's capture was met with a mixture of relief and anger from the community. For days, Athens had been on edge, with residents fearing that the killer was still among them. When the news broke that Ibarra had been found and arrested, many breathed a collective sigh of relief. The man responsible for Laken's brutal murder was finally in custody. Ibarra's capture was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated manhunt that spanned several days. Once he was apprehended, he was taken into custody and transported to the local jail, where he was booked on charges of murder, kidnapping, and assault. His arrest marked a key turning point in the investigation, but it also marked the beginning of another phase, the pursuit of justice in the courtroom. As police officers led Ibarra into the police station, media outlets were there to capture every moment. Reporters swarmed the scene, and cameras flashed as Ibarra was escorted by law enforcement. The public was eager to know more about the man responsible for taking Laken's life. Yet, as Ibarra was led away in handcuffs, he remained eerily silent, offering no clues as to his motives or the events that led to the killing. Laken's family, although relieved that the killer had been caught, were still reeling from the grief of losing their daughter. Her mother, in particular, was vocal about her desire for justice. "We want him to pay for what he did," she said, her voice shaking. "My daughter didn't deserve to die like this. No one deserves to die like this." The next steps in the case were clear. The legal system would now determine Ibarra's fate. His trial would become a focal point for the community, and the search for justice would continue in the courtroom, where every detail of Laken's death would be revealed in excruciating detail. The killer, Jose Antonio Ibarra's background, personality, and past. Jose Antonio Ibarra's journey from a troubled childhood to a violent crime was shaped by years of isolation, frustration, and a pervasive sense of being overlooked by society. His story is one of alienation, both from the world and from himself. Understanding his background is key to understanding how he became the man capable of taking the life of a young woman with so much promise. Born in Venezuela, Ibarra's early life was marked by a stark reality of poverty, crime, and systemic failure. He grew up in a rough neighborhood where survival often meant closing off emotions and focusing solely on getting by. His parents, struggling to make ends meet, did what they could, but Ibarra's environment offered little support. He grew up with a deep-seated resentment, not only toward the society that had failed him, but also toward the systems that perpetuated his family's hardship. This frustration began to simmer early, manifesting in acts of aggression and a profound sense of injustice. From a young age, Ibarra displayed a lack of empathy, frequently getting into trouble at school. His teachers saw him as a troubled child, one who isolated himself from peers and displayed a pattern of defiance toward authority figures. The frustration of not being able to connect with others turned into anger, and soon, that anger began to spiral into more destructive behaviors. He felt misunderstood and left behind in every possible way. Even within his own home, he felt disconnected from his family, never able to communicate his feelings or expectations. At the age of 18, Ibarra left Venezuela in search of better opportunities, convinced that a fresh start in the United States would offer him the chance to escape his past. However, the move only marked the beginning of a new set of struggles. Arriving in Miami with nothing but the clothes on his back and a few $100s, Ibarra found himself quickly sinking into the underbelly of society. The American dream seemed just out of reach as he faced the same obstacles he had encountered back home. No legal papers, no formal education, and no viable way to earn a living. Ibarra's situation worsened when he turned to petty crime to survive. He began to steal, committing small offenses like shoplifting, believing it was the only way to get by in a society that seemed indifferent to his existence. Though his criminal activities were relatively minor, they laid the foundation for a deeper and darker transformation in Ibarra's psyche. He began to view himself as a victim of a corrupt system, one that had promised opportunities but delivered nothing but failure. He justified his actions with the belief that the world owed him something, that his suffering had not been of his own making, but rather a consequence of the system that had failed him. But as his criminal record grew, so did his bitterness. Unable to find steady work and isolated from meaningful relationships, Ibarra's resentment toward the society he had hoped to build a life in grew stronger. He became increasingly angry at the world that had seemingly given him nothing, especially when he compared his life to the apparent ease with which others, those more privileged, lived. His inability to assimilate, coupled with his increasing disregard for laws and social norms, drove him to a breaking point. By the time Ibarra moved to Athens, Georgia, his emotional and mental state had deteriorated. He had become a man driven by anger, resentment, and an overwhelming sense of injustice. Despite his physical presence in a peaceful college town, his mind was consumed by chaos. He had no legal status and no prospects for work. The sense of being invisible in a society that prized stability and success only deepened his bitterness. The opportunities he had been promised as a young man had never materialized, and now, as an adult, he had nothing but resentment and emptiness. Ibarra's inability to connect with people, combined with his growing sense of isolation, made it difficult for him to form lasting relationships. His interpersonal connections were fleeting, and he never felt truly at home in any community. His rejection of authority, his disdain for the system that he believed had kept him down, was a defining characteristic of his personality. It was this disdain that led to his repeated offenses and, eventually, to his decision to live illegally in the United States. To him, society was something to be exploited, not something to be respected. As he settled into his life in Athens, Ibarra's emotional state became more volatile. He struggled to find work, and when he did, it was low-paying and unfulfilling. His life, which had already been marked by failure, now seemed to be falling apart around him. But it was not just his inability to succeed that fueled his anger. It was his inability to find a sense of belonging. The sense of powerlessness he felt grew into a rage that he no longer knew how to control. It was in this environment of emotional chaos that Ibarra crossed paths with Laken Riley. He was not looking for her specifically, but when he saw her that morning, something snapped. She became the object of his frustration, the person who would bear the brunt of the anger he had been harboring for years. The fact that she was an innocent young woman, full of life and promise, only seemed to magnify the bitterness Ibarra felt. In his twisted mind, she represented everything he would never have, the life he dreamed of but could never attain. And for a brief, terrible moment, Ibarra decided that he would take from her what he could never have. The attack on Laken Riley, while the result of Ibarra's spiraling anger, was also a consequence of his profound emotional instability. At that moment, he was no longer capable of making rational decisions. His rage clouded his judgment, and he saw in Laken not a person, but a symbol of everything he resented. The brutal way in which he ended her life was not just an act of violence. It was the culmination of years of pent-up frustration, alienation, and a complete inability to empathize with others. Ibarra's actions on that morning were not premeditated, but were instead the result of a psychological collapse, a tipping point that had been building for years. He did not know Laken, nor did he have any personal vendetta against her. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The randomness of the attack speaks volumes about Ibarra's emotional state. A man so lost in his own sense of rage and helplessness that he could lash out at anyone, regardless of their innocence. The horrific nature of Ibarra's crime is a reflection of his fractured psyche. It is the story of a man who had lost touch with his own humanity, someone who no longer saw the world in terms of shared experiences or empathy. His path to violence was not inevitable, but it was shaped by a lifetime of neglect, anger, and a desire for revenge against a world that had never given him the opportunities he had been promised. The investigation and hunt for justice. The investigation, uncovering the evidence. The morning after the brutal murder of Laken Riley, law enforcement officials in Athens were already working tirelessly to piece together the details of what had happened. As soon as the body was discovered, investigators knew they were dealing with a violent and calculated crime. Laken's life had been stolen in a way that no one expected. What had started as a routine morning jog for a young woman full of promise had ended in terror. But in the aftermath of the tragedy, it was clear that this was not an isolated incident. It was a crime that would reveal cracks in the system, point to failures in oversight, and demand accountability. Upon arrival at the crime scene, investigators were immediately struck by the brutal nature of Laken's death. The location was unsettling, an isolated stretch of jogging path near the edge of the University of Georgia's campus, typically a place where students came to find peace in their exercise routines. But on this morning, that peace was shattered in the most violent of ways. Forensic teams arrived quickly to examine the scene, collecting evidence that would be critical in identifying the killer. Laken's body was discovered lying face down near a wooded area just off the trail. The evidence indicated that she had been attacked while she was alone, with no warning. Her death had been fast, brutal, and without mercy. It was clear that her killer had intended to end her life quickly, striking her with a large rock after choking her into unconsciousness. The post-mortem examination would later confirm that she had been strangled first, a deliberate act that suggested a deep, personal rage. The forensic pathologist noted the severity of the injuries. Her skull was crushed, and the marks on her neck from the strangulation were unmistakable. From the moment the scene was processed, law enforcement knew that they needed to work swiftly. The brutality of the murder would soon make headlines across the state and beyond. But for now, the focus remained on gathering as much evidence as possible to build a case that could lead them to the person responsible. Detectives were aware that the physical evidence left at the scene could reveal much more than a victim's identity. It could also tell them who had done this and why. Forensic teams combed through the area, marking off sections of the ground and gathering all possible pieces of evidence. Blood samples, strands of hair, and any potential fingerprints were collected. Every footprint, every broken twig, every minute detail was scrutinized to uncover clues that could help law enforcement narrow down the suspect list. As each piece of evidence was logged and carefully preserved, it became increasingly clear that this would be a complex and emotionally charged investigation. It wasn't just a murder, it was an attack on an innocent young woman, a student with a bright future. The next significant breakthrough came from the nearby surveillance cameras. Thanks to the university's extensive network of security cameras, investigators were able to access footage that captured a key moment in the crime. The footage, however, was not perfect. It was grainy and difficult to make out, but the images were unmistakable. They showed a man walking on the path, trailing Laken just moments before the attack. The footage captured the man approaching Laken from behind as she jogged, and investigators could see him closing in on her from a distance. The images were not clear enough to identify the man by face, but they gave the investigators a crucial lead. The man was likely the perpetrator. The footage was just the beginning. With the grainy images in hand, the investigators began to work backward. They contacted the university's security team to gather additional footage from other cameras located along the route Laken had run. Within hours, they had pieced together more footage that showed the same man walking behind her for several minutes. The man was later identified as Jose Antonio Ibarra, who had been living in Athens under a false identity. As they confirmed his identity, investigators began to dig deeper into Ibarra's background. His criminal record, though filled with minor infractions, was troubling. Ibarra had been arrested multiple times for petty theft and other low-level offenses, but each time, the charges were dismissed or reduced. He had never faced significant punishment for any of his crimes. His most recent arrest had been for shoplifting, but there had been no serious consequences. This pattern of legal oversight had allowed Ibarra to continue his life without being fully held accountable for his actions, despite his repeated brushes with the law. Despite his criminal history, Ibarra had managed to evade serious charges. His status as an illegal immigrant meant that he had never fully integrated into the system, which meant he was able to stay off the radar, slipping through the cracks of law enforcement. This, of course, led to anger and frustration among the community members, who now saw Ibarra not only as a murderer, but as someone who had exploited the system. The failure to deport him earlier had allowed him to carry out his crime with little to no fear of consequence. With the forensic evidence, security footage, and Ibarra's criminal background pointing to him as the prime suspect, the manhunt for him began. Law enforcement worked diligently to locate him, setting up checkpoints and collaborating with various state and federal agencies. Local authorities feared that Ibarra might attempt to flee the area, given his history of evading serious punishment. A sense of urgency hung in the air as the investigation continued to unfold. Days turned into a tense waiting game. As police closed in on Ibarra's whereabouts, the public remained on edge, unsure when the killer would be captured. Meanwhile, the media coverage of the case became even more intense. News outlets, both local and national, were following the investigation closely, offering real-time updates and keeping the public informed. The atmosphere in Athens had shifted completely. What was once a quiet college town had become the center of a high-stakes criminal investigation, and the search for justice was beginning to shape the narrative in unexpected ways. The pressure on law enforcement to capture Ibarra was immense. Community members rallied behind the cause, with many demanding that the authorities take swift and decisive action. Social media exploded with updates, and public outcry grew louder as the days passed. In the eyes of the public, Ibarra had already been tried and convicted by the court of public opinion. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a tip led investigators to a location in a remote part of Georgia. The manhunt, which had been a source of constant tension and fear, came to a close when Ibarra was arrested without resistance. As news of his capture spread, the residents of Athens breathed a collective sigh of relief. The killer had been caught, and the wait for justice was finally over. But as Ibarra was transported to jail, the real battle for justice was only just beginning. The next phase of the investigation would lead into the courtrooms, where Ibarra would face the consequences of his actions. But even as the legal process began, the trauma of what had happened to Laken Riley would continue to ripple through the community. The investigation had uncovered the truth, but the scars left behind by the crime would take far longer to heal. The investigation and hunt for justice. Confirming the suspect, the hunt for Jose Antonio Ibarra. By the time law enforcement officials had processed the crime scene and reviewed the available evidence, it was clear they had a suspect. Jose Antonio Ibarra, a man with a history of minor criminal offenses and undocumented immigration status, was identified as the primary suspect in Laken Riley's brutal murder. What followed was a high-stakes manhunt that would span days, shaking the University of Georgia community to its core. The surveillance footage had been the key to uncovering Ibarra's involvement in the crime. What was initially a vague, grainy image of a man walking behind Laken on the jogging path had become the cornerstone of the investigation. The more footage investigators gathered, the clearer it became that Ibarra had been present at the crime scene. But finding Ibarra in the vast expanse of Georgia proved to be a daunting task. While the forensic evidence, blood samples, DNA, and fingerprint analysis linked Ibarra to the scene, there were still questions that remained. Why had Ibarra chosen to attack Laken that morning? Was it a random act of violence, or had he been targeting her specifically? What had driven him to such extreme measures? Investigators could only speculate as they searched for Ibarra. As authorities began to piece together the details of his movements, they realized that Ibarra was no stranger to evading detection. His criminal record, though filled with minor offenses, revealed a pattern of behavior that suggested a man who knew how to avoid serious consequences. His illegal immigration status meant that he lived in the shadows, never fully integrated into society. He had evaded arrest multiple times before, and now he had slipped away once more. The search for Ibarra took on a heightened sense of urgency. As the manhunt intensified, the community's fear grew. Laken's death had already shattered the sense of security that once defined the University of Georgia's campus. Now, with the killer still on the loose, students, faculty, and residents alike were on edge. Many students were afraid to walk alone or go for a run, and campus security protocols were re-evaluated in light of the murder. What had once been a safe, thriving academic environment now felt tainted by the violence that had erupted on its grounds. Local law enforcement worked around the clock to track down Ibarra, but it wasn't until the authorities began using more advanced resources that they started to close in on him. The FBI, who had been called in to assist with the case, began working with state and local agencies to gather intelligence on Ibarra's whereabouts. They tracked his movements using phone records and social media activity, piecing together the last known locations where he had been seen. As days passed, Ibarra's location became more defined. The search expanded beyond Athens, reaching into the neighboring counties and areas where Ibarra was known to have lived or visited in the past. Local police officers were briefed on his appearance and criminal history, and the entire state was put on alert. Authorities feared that Ibarra might attempt to flee to another state or even cross the border into Mexico. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Laken's murder had sent shockwaves through the entire community, and the police knew they had to act fast to prevent further escalation. By now, the media had become a key player in the unfolding investigation. News outlets, both local and national, had been covering the case nonstop, offering updates on the investigation and manhunt. Journalists from across the country were tracking every lead, speaking with law enforcement officials, and following the search in real time. As the manhunt continued, the media began to paint a picture of Ibarra's background, revealing his illegal immigration status, his prior encounters with law enforcement, and his apparent history of evading justice. Stories highlighting his criminal past and the system's repeated failure to hold him accountable started to dominate headlines. For the public, the case had become more than just a local tragedy. It was a symbol of broader issues within the justice system, especially regarding immigration and law enforcement. Questions were raised about how someone with Ibarra's criminal history had been allowed to remain in the country. How many more potential victims were there, and how many more criminals like Ibarra had slipped through the cracks of the system? Despite the growing media frenzy, the manhunt was painstakingly methodical. The police knew they couldn't afford to make mistakes. Investigators spent hours speaking with people who might have known Ibarra, revisiting locations he had frequented, and gathering any new tips that might lead them to his whereabouts. The public's role in the case became critical, as law enforcement officials pleaded for information and tips from the community. If Ibarra was hiding out, someone must have seen him, or at least heard something that could lead to his capture. Finally, after days of searching, a breakthrough came. A tip from a local resident who recognized Ibarra from the media led authorities to a rural area in a neighboring county. With the help of a task force, the police staked out the area, carefully tracking Ibarra's movements. As the hours passed, tension in the air mounted. If they had lost him, it would be nearly impossible to track him down again. The night of the arrest, law enforcement officers set up a perimeter around the area, ensuring that Ibarra would have no escape route. As the search closed in, they found Ibarra hiding in a dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of a small town. He was taken into custody without a fight, and the sense of relief that washed over the community was palpable. The killer was no longer at large. Aftermath of the capture. As the authorities transported Ibarra to the local jail, the community breathed a collective sigh of relief. For the first time since Laken's death, there was a sense of closure. at least for the moment. The manhunt was over, and the next chapter in the quest for justice was about to unfold. But as news of his capture spread, the questions only grew louder. Why had Ibarra killed Laken? What had driven him to commit such a brutal and senseless crime? And perhaps most importantly, would justice be served? For Laken's family, the capture was bittersweet. While they were relieved that Ibarra had been caught, the pain of losing their daughter was still raw. Laken's mother, speaking through her grief, said, "This isn't over for us. It's just the beginning. We want justice for Laken, and we will not rest until we get it." The media coverage surrounding Ibarra's capture reached a fever pitch. Cameras flashed as he was led into the courthouse for his arraignment, and reporters lined the streets outside, waiting for any hint of a statement from Ibarra's family or legal team. Inside the courtroom, the next phase of the legal battle would begin, a trial that would ultimately determine Ibarra's fate and bring the case to a close. For Ibarra's family, the news was nothing short of devastating. Though they had not known the full extent of his actions, they were now faced with the reality of what he had done. Many of them struggled to understand how the man they had known as a son, brother, and cousin could have committed such a heinous act. They were in shock, and as the trial drew closer, the emotional toll on them would be felt as well. As the community of Athens grappled with the aftermath of the manhunt, the next steps in the legal process would determine the extent of the justice that would be served. But for now, the immediate goal had been achieved. The killer was caught, and Laken's family could begin to process the loss, knowing that justice would follow. The investigation and hunt for justice. Reactions from families after Ibarra's capture. The arrest of Jose Antonio Ibarra brought with it a heavy sense of closure for many, but for Laken Riley's family, it was bittersweet. The relief of knowing that the man who had brutally taken their daughter's life was no longer on the loose was tempered by the painful reality that nothing could undo the loss they had suffered. Laken was gone, and despite the killer being captured, the grief remained unrelenting. It was now time for them to take the next steps in the pursuit of justice. Laken's parents, John and Maria Riley, had been vocal in their pleas for justice throughout the investigation. From the moment they learned of their daughter's death, they had vowed to ensure that the killer would be held accountable. Now, standing in the wake of Ibarra's capture, their focus was squarely on the trial that lay ahead. The arrest, though an important step, was only the beginning of a much longer journey. John Riley, his eyes red from days of grief and sleepless nights, was quick to speak to the media after Ibarra's arrest. "It's a relief that he's been caught," John said, his voice shaking. "But it doesn't bring Laken back. No amount of time or punishment will bring her back. We want to see this through. We want justice for Laken. She didn't deserve this, and neither does anyone else." Maria Riley, standing beside her husband, held a handkerchief to her face, trying to hide the tears. "I just don't understand why this happened," she said softly. "She was so young, so full of life. She had so much to give. And now she's gone because of one man's senseless violence." Her voice cracked, but she stood tall. "We'll fight for her. We'll make sure the world knows who Laken was. She deserves to be remembered for her life, not just for the way she was taken from us." The Rileys' words echoed the sentiments of many in the community who were deeply affected by Laken's death. The impact of her murder was far-reaching, and as news of Ibarra's capture spread, there was a sense of collective relief. However, the journey toward justice was still fraught with emotional and legal hurdles. The murder trial would soon begin, and it would be in the courtroom that the true extent of the tragedy would come to light. The Rileys' words echoed the sentiments of many in the community who were deeply affected by Laken's death. The impact of her murder was far-reaching, and as news of Ibarra's capture spread, there was a sense of collective relief. However, the journey toward justice was still fraught with emotional and legal hurdles. The murder trial would soon begin, and it would be in the courtroom that the true extent of the tragedy would come to light. Ibarra's family, a contrasting reaction. While Laken's family focused on the pursuit of justice, Ibarra's family was forced to confront an entirely different reality. They had spent days in shock and disbelief, unable to fully grasp the weight of what had occurred. The media had painted Ibarra as a cold-blooded killer, a man with a history of criminal activity who had slipped through the cracks of the system. But for his family, the man arrested was still their son, their brother, their cousin. Maria Ibarra, Jose Antonio Ibarra's mother, spoke to reporters for the first time after his capture. She was visibly distraught, her face pale and haggard from days of sleeplessness and worry. "I never thought it would come to this," she said, her voice trembling. "Jose was always quiet, always keeping to himself, but I never thought he would do something like this. He was my son. I raised him to know right from wrong. This isn't the man I knew." Her words reflected the shock and confusion felt by many in Ibarra's family. They had never imagined that he was capable of such an act. The realization that their loved one had been responsible for taking an innocent life was something they were still processing. "How did it happen?" one relative asked in an interview with a local news outlet. "What went wrong? How did it all spiral into this?" Ibarra's family, though devastated, were left grappling with the public perception of their loved one. They found themselves in a position where they had to come to terms not only with the fact that their family member was a murderer, but also with the profound shame and guilt they felt as a result. There were no easy answers. For them, the shame was twofold: the loss of their son and the loss of any hope of rehabilitation for him. Ibarra's actions had forever changed the way his family saw him, and they now faced a future where he would be known not as a son or a brother, but as a criminal. Ibarra's aunt, who had been one of the few family members to speak publicly, expressed her own disbelief. "He was a quiet guy," she said. "He always kept to himself. He didn't talk much, but he wasn't a monster. I don't understand how this happened." Her voice wavered with a mixture of confusion and sorrow, as if trying to reconcile the person she had known with the man who had committed such a horrific act. Despite their attempts to explain or defend his actions, Ibarra's family was now burdened with the knowledge that no matter how much they tried to understand or rationalize his behavior, it could never erase the pain he had caused. The image of the man who had been their son, nephew, or brother was forever tainted by the murder of Laken Riley. And while they may have mourned the person they once knew, they could never escape the fact that their loved one was responsible for a devastating loss. Community response and media scrutiny. As the days passed after Ibarra's capture, the public's reaction became more complex. The outrage over the brutal nature of Laken's murder was still fresh, but with Ibarra now in custody, many began to reflect on the deeper issues surrounding his criminal history and immigration status. Media outlets continued to scrutinize his background, delving into his past arrests and the failures of the justice system that had allowed him to remain free despite his criminal record. For many, Ibarra's arrest did little to ease the underlying tension that had been growing in the community. The issue of immigration and its relationship to crime was now at the forefront of public debate. The fact that Ibarra had entered the United States illegally, coupled with his previous criminal offenses, raised questions about the effectiveness of the immigration system. Advocates for stricter immigration controls seized on Ibarra's case as an example of the dangers of a broken system. On the other side of the debate, there were those who cautioned against turning the tragedy into a political argument. Local community leaders called for compassion and understanding, reminding the public that the murder of Laken Riley was about a human life being taken, not about broader political issues. "We must not forget that a life was lost and a family is mourning," said one local activist. "This tragedy is about justice for Laken, and it should not be hijacked for political gain." Despite the media frenzy and public debate, for Laken's family, the focus remained squarely on securing justice for their daughter. "We'll keep fighting," said Maria Riley. "We won't let anyone forget who Laken was and what she stood for. She deserves that. We owe it to her." The next steps, the legal battle ahead. With Ibarra now in custody, the legal battle was set to begin. The next phase of the journey would take Laken's family into the courtroom, where they would face the harsh realities of the criminal justice system. They knew that this would be a long and difficult process, but they were determined to see it through. Every step forward, no matter how small, was one closer to holding Ibarra accountable for the crime he had committed. The legal proceedings would not only determine Ibarra's fate, but they would also be the setting for a public reckoning. The details of Laken's murder would be brought to light in full, and the question of Ibarra's motives would be explored in painstaking detail. Would the defense attempt to paint a picture of mental instability? Would they seek leniency based on his background and life experiences? These were questions that would be answered in the months to come, but for now, Laken's family could only wait and prepare for the fight that lay ahead. In the meantime, Laken's legacy began to take shape in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. Memorials were held in her honor, and her friends rallied together to ensure that her story was told, not as a victim, but as the vibrant, compassionate young woman she had been. But for the Rileys, the real fight was just beginning. The trial and the battle for justice. The trial begins, the courtroom drama unfolds. The day of Jose Antonio Ibarra's trial arrived with heavy anticipation. It was a day that marked a significant turning point in the journey for justice for Laken Riley's family, yet also a day filled with immense emotional weight. The courtroom in Athens, Georgia, was filled with journalists, law enforcement officers, and members of the public, all awaiting the trial's start. For many, this was not simply a trial. It was a battle for accountability and a chance to ensure the memory of Laken was honored. March 15, 2024, opening statements. At 9 a.m. sharp, Judge Carter entered the courtroom, his presence signaling the official start of the trial. The public gallery filled with a mix of media, local community members, and Laken's family, all eager to witness the proceedings unfold. The courtroom was tense, as all eyes were on the man accused of taking Laken's life, sitting quietly at the defense table. His face was stoic, but the weight of the moment seemed to sit heavily on him. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Janet Harris, was the first to speak. With confidence and clarity, Harris began her opening statement. This case is about a young woman with a promising future, whose life was stolen by the defendant, Jose Antonio Ibarra. It is a case about brutality, about the end of innocence, and about the undeniable evidence that links the defendant to the crime. She outlined the events of February 22, 2024, the day Laken was murdered, and set the tone for the trial to follow. The defendant, Harris continued, followed Laken on her morning jog, attacked her in broad daylight, and ended her life with unspeakable violence. He did not know her. She was simply a victim of his frustration, of his rage that was ultimately unleashed in a senseless act of murder. Harris emphasized the evidence, the DNA, the fingerprint analysis, the surveillance footage from campus cameras that clearly showed Ibarra following Laken. The jury was reminded that the prosecution would prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Ibarra was the killer. When the defense team, led by attorney Richard Fields, stood to give their opening statement, the tone in the courtroom shifted. No one disputes that a life was lost that day. No one disputes that this was a tragedy. But what we ask you to consider is why this happened, Fields said, making direct eye contact with the jury. Jose Ibarra is not a monster. He's a man who has been deeply affected by his circumstances, his mental health, his isolation, his struggles in this society. This is not a case of premeditated murder. This is the result of a man who snapped under the weight of years of personal torment. Fields continued, suggesting that Ibarra's actions were not entirely his own, but instead were a result of long-standing mental health issues, depression, and frustration. He didn't plan this. He wasn't in his right mind when he killed Laken Riley. We will show that the defendant was suffering from diminished capacity and could not have had the full mental capacity to plan or execute the crime. The opening statement set the tone for the months to come. The stage was set, a tragic crime, an accused man, and two very different explanations for what had transpired on that fateful morning. March 17, 2024, testimonies begin, the victim's legacy. The trial proceeded to its next phase just days after opening statements. On March 17th, witnesses began to take the stand. Laken's family was the first to testify, speaking about her life, her dreams, and the devastating loss they had suffered. Laken's best friend, Sarah Johnson, described her as a compassionate, ambitious young woman who was always there for those around her. Laken was someone who could make you feel better just by being near her, Sarah said through tears. She was driven by a desire to help others. She was studying to become a nurse. It wasn't just a job to her, it was her calling. Sarah's emotional testimony left a powerful impact on the jury. As she described Laken's personality, her love for life, and the bright future she had ahead of her, it became impossible to deny the harsh reality of the loss. Laken was not just another victim. She was a person who had made a lasting impact on those around her. Later that day, a university professor took the stand. Dr. John Miller, Laken's academic advisor, described her as one of the most dedicated and hardworking students he had ever mentored. She was determined to make a difference, Dr. Miller said, his voice filled with emotion. Laken wanted to work with underserved communities, providing health care to those who needed it most. She was the type of student who not only excelled in class, but inspired others to push themselves to do their best. The jury was beginning to understand the depth of Laken's character and the bright future that was abruptly cut short by Ibarra's actions. But as the emotional testimonies continued, it became clear that the defense would also try to frame the trial around Ibarra's personal struggles and emotional state. March 25, 2024, expert testimonies, mental health defenses raised. As the trial moved into its second week, the defense began calling on expert witnesses. On March 25th, Dr. Susan Calhoun, a forensic psychiatrist, took the stand. Dr. Calhoun was an expert in mental health evaluations, and her testimony was pivotal in establishing the defense's case for diminished capacity. Mr. Ibarra has suffered from severe depression for years, Dr. Calhoun explained to the jury. He has also exhibited signs of acute anxiety and feelings of alienation. In my professional opinion, these factors played a significant role in his ability to think clearly and rationally on the day of the crime. Dr. Calhoun's testimony aimed to show that Ibarra had not been in control of his actions when he murdered Laken. The defense sought to make the case that while Ibarra's actions were undeniably violent, they were not premeditated. Instead, they argued, the murder was the result of a psychological breakdown, a culmination of years of mental health struggles, compounded by his feelings of isolation and frustration with life. The prosecution, however, wasted no time in challenging Dr. Calhoun's testimony. On March 28, 2024, they brought in their own expert, Dr. James Patterson, a renowned forensic psychologist. Dr. Patterson's evaluation of Ibarra's mental state was starkly different. Mr. Ibarra is certainly experiencing emotional distress, but he was fully aware of what he was doing at the time of the crime, Dr. Patterson testified. He was not suffering from a condition that would have impaired his ability to understand right from wrong. He knew exactly what he was doing when he attacked Laken Riley. The back and forth between the two expert witnesses set the stage for a heated legal debate. The prosecution insisted that Ibarra was fully aware of his actions, while the defense sought to portray him as a man whose mental health struggles had caused him to snap. April 5, 2024, closing arguments, a final plea for justice. As the trial entered its final stages, the emotional toll on both families was clear. For Laken's parents, the agony of hearing their daughter's life recounted in vivid detail was almost too much to bear. They had hoped the trial would offer them some sense of closure, but the pain of reliving Laken's death, day after day, was overwhelming. On April 5, 2024, the closing arguments began. The prosecution's attorney, Janet Harris, made a passionate plea to the jury. This is not a case about mental illness or diminished capacity, she argued. This is a case about cold-blooded murder. Ibarra took a life, my client's daughter's life, without reason, without remorse, and with a clear understanding of what he was doing. He deserves to be held fully accountable for that. The defense countered, asking the jury to consider Ibarra's life before the murder. The years of isolation, the lack of support, the mental health struggles that had led to that fateful day. Jose Ibarra did not intend to take Laken's life, the defense attorney argued. He was overwhelmed by years of emotional pain. Yes, he caused her death, but he did so as a man who was not in control of his actions. The jury was now faced with the difficult task of determining Ibarra's fate. Would they see him as a cold-blooded killer, or a man whose emotional and mental distress had pushed him to commit an unthinkable act? The trial and the battle for justice. The battle for conviction, the jury's deliberation and final verdict. The courtroom was quiet as the final day of the trial dawned. After weeks of testimony, expert analysis, and emotional statements from both sides, the fate of Jose Antonio Ibarra was now in the hands of the jury. The question before them was clear. Was Ibarra guilty of first-degree murder, or could he be convicted of a lesser crime due to his claimed mental instability? Would the prosecution's evidence of brutality and premeditated violence outweigh the defense's argument of diminished capacity? The tension was palpable as the court recessed for closing arguments. April 7, 2024, closing arguments and jury instructions. On April 7, 2024, the closing arguments began. Both sides had spent weeks building their cases, and now they would summarize everything for the jury. The prosecution's closing statement was impassioned, focusing on the brutal nature of Laken's murder and the overwhelming evidence that pointed directly to Ibarra. Assistant District Attorney Janet Harris took the floor first. "This was no crime of passion," she said, looking directly at the jury. "This was cold, calculated, and brutal. The defendant followed Laken Riley, attacked her, and ended her life without a second thought. He knew exactly what he was doing, and no amount of mental illness or frustration can excuse the crime he committed." Harris emphasized the lack of remorse shown by Ibarra throughout the investigation and trial, underscoring the defendant's complete disregard for Laken's humanity. "The evidence is clear," Harris continued. "We have DNA linking Ibarra to the scene, eyewitness testimony, and video footage of him following Laken that morning. He was not out of control, he was fully aware of what he was doing. He acted out of violence, and he must be held accountable for his actions. The defense, in contrast, focused on the psychological struggles that they believed led to Ibarra's actions. Defense attorney Richard Fields stood and addressed the jury. Yes, the murder of Laken Riley was horrific, but that does not mean we should ignore the complex factors that led to it. Jose Ibarra was a man who had lived in isolation for years. He was alienated, depressed, and overwhelmed by feelings of inadequacy. His actions that morning were not premeditated. They were the result of a breakdown in his mental state. Fields reminded the jury that while Ibarra's crime was terrible, it was not committed by a cold-blooded killer. We are asking you to consider the man behind the crime. He didn't set out to murder Laken Riley. This was a man who had suffered deeply. A man who, at the moment of the attack, could not fully grasp the consequences of his actions. As the closing arguments wrapped up, Judge Carter gave the jury their final instructions. They would need to deliberate on whether Ibarra was guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter. He also instructed them on the definition of diminished capacity, explaining that if they found that Ibarra lacked the mental state necessary for premeditation, they could consider a conviction for a lesser offense. With those instructions, the jury retired to deliberate. April 8, 2024, the jury deliberates. As the jury began deliberating on April 8th, the tension in the courtroom and the community was palpable. Laken's family, who had been present throughout the entire trial, sat in the same seats they had occupied each day, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. They had watched the evidence unfold, they had heard the impassioned statements from the prosecution, and they had listened to the defense's attempt to humanize Ibarra. But now, all they could do was wait. Would the jury see Ibarra for what he was, a cold-blooded murderer, or would they be swayed by the argument that his mental health issues had played a role in his crime? The jury's deliberation stretched on for several days. Inside the jury room, the panel of 12 men and women discussed the case in detail. They reviewed the evidence carefully, revisiting the crime scene photos, the forensic analysis, and the expert testimonies that had been presented. They debated Ibarra's mental state, considering the defense's argument that his psychological struggles had impaired his judgment. Some jurors felt that the prosecution's evidence was irrefutable, that Ibarra had acted with clear intent, and that his lack of remorse demonstrated his coldness. Others felt torn by the defense's argument that his mental health had deteriorated to the point where he had lost control. The jurors debated the nature of diminished capacity, with some arguing that a man who had been as isolated as Ibarra was less likely to act rationally when pushed to the edge. For Laken's family, each passing hour without a verdict was a reminder of the pain they had already endured. The wait was excruciating. Laken's parents, John and Maria Riley, spent their days in a mix of numbness and dread, wondering if the justice they had longed for would come. "It's been so hard," Maria said in an interview outside the courthouse. "We've been living this nightmare for months. All we want is justice for Laken. She didn't deserve this." April 10th, 2024, the verdict. On April 10th, 2024, the jury finally reached a verdict. At 2 p.m., they returned to the courtroom. The gallery was filled with reporters, family members, and onlookers, all waiting for the moment that would determine Ibarra's fate. Laken's family sat in tense silence, their hands clasped together. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Judge Carter asked the jury foreperson to stand and deliver the verdict. The foreperson cleared their throat, then read aloud the decision that would change everything. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jose Antonio Ibarra, guilty of first-degree murder." A collective breath seemed to escape the courtroom. Laken's family sat still for a moment, their expressions unreadable. Then, tears began to stream down Maria Riley's face as she reached for her husband's hand. They had gotten what they had hoped for, the justice that their daughter deserved. But even in the wake of the verdict, the loss of Laken still hung heavily in the air. The reality of her absence would never be erased by any verdict. Ibarra, meanwhile, showed no visible reaction to the verdict. His face remained expressionless as the guilty verdict was read. His defense team seemed disappointed but resigned. The prosecution, on the other hand, exhaled quietly, knowing that the fight for justice had culminated in a moment of victory. April 15th, 2024, sentencing. The final stage of the trial was the sentencing hearing, which took place on April 15th, 2024. Laken's family was once again in the courtroom, determined to ensure that Ibarra would face the full weight of the law for his actions. Prosecutor Janet Harris spoke passionately, urging the court to impose the maximum sentence. Laken Riley's life was stolen, and the man who took it must be held accountable. There is no excuse for the violence he inflicted, and there is no mitigating factor that justifies what he did. He must be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The defense made a final plea for leniency, citing Ibarra's mental health struggles. Jose Ibarra is not beyond redemption, said Richard Fields, his voice soft but firm. We ask the court to consider his history, his mental state, and the possibility of rehabilitation. But the judge, after considering all aspects of the case, ruled in favor of the prosecution's request. Jose Antonio Ibarra is hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Judge Carter said. The crime he committed was one of such brutality and callousness that no lesser sentence would suffice. Laken's family, although relieved by the verdict, knew that no sentence could ever bring their daughter back. Still, they felt a sense of justice for Laken, a sense that her memory had been honored and that the system had held the man responsible for her death accountable. The aftermath, reflections on justice. As the courtroom cleared and the trial came to a close, Laken's family reflected on the long road they had traveled. They had witnessed the legal battle, the emotional testimony, and the psychological analysis of Ibarra's mental state. While the verdict brought them a sense of justice, the void left by Laken's death would never be filled. But in the end, they knew that they had fought for her, and that her life and her memory had been given the respect they deserved. The trial and the battle for justice. The aftermath, the impact of the trial and Ibarra's fate. The gavel fell on April 15, 2024, sealing Jose Antonio Ibarra's fate with a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Laken Riley's family, the sentence was both a triumph and a reminder of the permanent void left by their daughter's death. It was the end of a long and painful chapter, but the scars of the tragedy remained, a testament to the brutal reality of what they had endured. As the courtroom cleared, Laken's family stood, still reeling from the emotional toll of the trial. Maria Riley, her face tear-streaked but resolute, took a moment to glance around the room. The journey had been long, the waiting agonizing, but now that it was over, she could finally take a breath. She had done everything she could to ensure that her daughter's memory was preserved and that justice had been done. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The pain never goes away, Maria said, her voice soft but firm. We got justice, but we lost our daughter. That's something we can never get back. Laken's father, John Riley, stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He hadn't spoken much throughout the trial, but now he added quietly, "We fought for her. We got the verdict we wanted, but it doesn't bring her back. It doesn't change the fact that she's gone. We'll never be the same." The sentencing had come with a measure of closure, but it was not a victory. It was a reminder that no amount of legal retribution could ever restore what had been lost. For Laken's parents, the pain of their daughter's absence remained an unhealable wound. Laken's legacy, moving forward in the face of tragedy. In the days following the trial, the media continued to report on the case, reflecting on the emotional toll it had taken on Laken's family and the Athens community. Tributes poured in from all corners, friends, classmates, faculty members, and even strangers who had been touched by the story. Laken's legacy was honored not just in the courtroom, but in the lives she had touched during her time on Earth. A memorial service was held on April 17, 2024, at the University of Georgia, where Laken had been a beloved student. It was a somber event, but one that celebrated her life rather than focusing solely on her tragic end. Hundreds of students, faculty, and family members gathered to share their memories of Laken and to show their support for her grieving family. "Laken made a difference," said one of her professors who spoke at the service. "She inspired so many of us with her compassion, her work ethic, and her desire to help others. She was on a path to do incredible things in the world, and that is what we will remember." In a quiet corner of the ceremony, Laken's parents stood together, surrounded by their closest friends. They had been through hell, and now they were left to navigate a life without their daughter. But the memorial was a bittersweet reminder of the impact she had. Though they would never stop mourning her, Laken's memory would live on in the hearts of those who had known her, in the countless lives she had touched. The outpouring of support from the community, though comforting, did little to ease the constant ache. Laken's parents felt as though they were living in two worlds, one where their daughter was gone, and one where her legacy would continue to inspire those who had been fortunate enough to know her. Ibarra's fate, a reflection of the legal system and his life behind bars. As the days went on, Ibarra was transferred to a state prison to begin serving his life sentence. Though the trial was over, his case had left an indelible mark on the public discourse. The legal questions raised during the trial, particularly regarding his mental state and the defense of diminished capacity, continued to spark debates. Some believed that the justice system had failed to provide adequate support for Ibarra's mental health issues, which might have contributed to his actions. Others felt that his crime was too heinous to be excused by any mental condition. Ibarra's family, though devastated by the sentence, still struggled with the man they thought they knew. Jose's mother, Maria Ibarra, had visited him in prison shortly after the sentencing. She described the encounter as surreal, unable to reconcile the man who had been a quiet, reclusive son with the brutal murderer he had become in the eyes of the public. "I can't look at him the same way," Maria Ibarra confessed during an interview shortly after the sentencing. "I don't know what went wrong. He was my son. But what he did, there's no explanation for that. I don't know how to forgive him. I don't know if I ever will." The complexity of Ibarra's situation, his troubled background, mental health struggles, and the undeniable nature of his crime, remained a subject of much debate. While many felt he deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison, others wondered if there could have been a better system in place to address the mental health issues that seemed to have played a role in his actions. In prison, Ibarra was placed in solitary confinement for his own safety, as his crime had made him a target among other inmates. Reports about his time behind bars indicated that he had become increasingly isolated, living with the psychological consequences of his actions. There were no indications that he had shown any remorse for his crime during his incarceration. Instead, Ibarra remained emotionally distant, reflecting on his past but offering little in terms of self-reflection. He wrote letters, but they were not to apologize for the crime he had committed. Instead, he spoke of the struggles he had faced throughout his life, his isolation, his sense of being misunderstood, and the overwhelming anger that had eventually led him to commit murder. Yet, in these letters, there was no acknowledgement of the life he had taken or the pain he had caused. He was, in many ways, still trapped in his own narrative, unable or unwilling to accept full responsibility for the devastation he had wrought. The long road ahead for Laken's family. While the trial had ended and the legal proceedings were over, Laken's family knew that their journey was far from complete. The pain of losing their daughter would never truly fade. Maria and John Riley, along with Laken's extended family, had learned to cope with the emptiness of her absence, but the grief remained an ever-present companion. In the months following the trial, Laken's parents began to channel their pain into something constructive. They established a scholarship fund in her name, designed to help students pursuing careers in nursing, particularly those interested in working with underserved communities, an area that had always been Laken's passion. It was their way of ensuring that her legacy would live on in a meaningful way, not just in their memories, but in the lives of others. At the same time, the Rileys advocated for stronger mental health support systems within the prison system, as they believed that Ibarra's life of isolation and frustration had played a significant role in his crime. While they would never forgive him for what he had done, they hoped that his case could serve as a turning point for both criminal justice and mental health reform. "The justice system worked, but we can't stop there," Maria Riley said in an interview. "There are so many people out there suffering silently. We have to do better. No one else should have to go through what we've gone through." The conviction of Jose Antonio Ibarra marked the end of a painful chapter in Laken Riley's family's journey. But it was not the end of their fight for justice. Their pursuit of a better system, one that addresses both crime and mental health, would continue. And through it all, they carried with them the memory of their daughter, a memory that no verdict could ever erase, but a legacy that would live on for generations to come. The psychological toll, Ibarra's mind, and the cost of violence. The prison life of Jose Antonio Ibarra. Jose Antonio Ibarra's life in prison is defined by isolation and stagnation. Since his conviction for the brutal murder of Laken Riley, he has been confined to a small cell in solitary confinement, removed from the general population for his own safety. This isolation, far from offering solace, has only deepened his psychological struggles, leaving him to wrestle with his inner demons without the possibility of meaningful change. Ibarra's days are spent in routine silence. He eats his meals alone, reads books that are often disconnected from his reality, and writes letters, most of them to his family or legal team. His communication with the outside world is minimal, limited to sporadic letters and rare visits from his mother, who, despite the overwhelming grief she feels for her son's actions, continues to maintain some level of connection with him. In the quiet of his cell, Ibarra has no distractions, no escape from his thoughts. But instead of using this time for introspection that could lead to genuine remorse, he remains ensnared by his victimhood narrative. He has never fully confronted the magnitude of his crime or the irreparable harm he caused to Laken's family. Instead, he fixates on his own suffering, on the years of alienation, the frustration of being rejected by society, and the overwhelming sense that he was never given a fair chance. Prison psychologists, such as Dr. Evelyn Gray, who have worked with Ibarra over the years, report that he continues to struggle with basic emotional regulation. Despite being given opportunities for counseling, his emotional state is erratic, often slipping between anger, self-pity, and moments of brief clarity that never seem to last. When asked to reflect on Laken's death, Ibarra's responses are detached and often contradictory. He acknowledges the crime, but does so in a way that distances him from the reality of his actions. "I didn't mean to kill her," Ibarra told Dr. Gray during one session, "but I just couldn't take it anymore. I saw her, and I saw everything I would never have, and I did what I had to do. It wasn't even a choice. It was the only thing left." Though his words suggest an understanding of the crime, they lack the true remorse expected in someone facing the consequences of their actions. His reasoning is shallow, disconnected from any real acceptance of responsibility for taking Laken's life. The continuing struggle, denial, and reflection. In Ibarra's mind, the question of why he murdered Laken Riley remains unresolved. He has reflected on it countless times, but each time the answer remains elusive, buried beneath layers of anger, resentment, and an unwillingness to confront the true nature of his crime. He doesn't want to acknowledge the premeditated nature of his actions, nor does he seem to recognize the full extent of the emotional damage he inflicted on Laken's family. Despite these struggles, there are fleeting moments where Ibarra expresses a form of self-awareness. Occasionally, when prompted, he will admit that what he did was terrible, but his apology never extends beyond the superficial. "What I did was wrong," he wrote in one of his letters, "but I didn't know how to deal with everything that was happening to me. I just broke." These expressions of guilt are never followed by genuine steps toward change. Ibarra is stuck in a cycle of blaming external forces, his upbringing, his mental health struggles, and the societal rejection he felt. Even when he begins to approach the realization that Laken was a victim of his own rage, his focus always returns to his personal pain. "I didn't have a chance," he wrote in another letter. "Everything in my life was leading me to that moment. She was just in my way. She had everything I wanted, and I couldn't stand it anymore." The lack of genuine remorse remains troubling. It's clear that Ibarra still doesn't understand the value of the life he took or the deep, irreparable damage he caused. To him, Laken's death is not the tragic consequence of his actions, but the result of his own emotional collapse. The prison system's limitations, the inability to change. Ibarra's prison experience is marked by missed opportunities for meaningful rehabilitation. While the prison offers programs aimed at helping inmates confront their past actions, including anger management and emotional regulation courses, Ibarra has never fully engaged with these resources. His participation in therapy sessions is erratic at best, and his refusal to confront his responsibility for the murder makes his chances for personal transformation slim. The prison system has made attempts to address his emotional struggles, but the reality is that the environment Ibarra exists in, one of isolation, neglect, and emotional stagnation, only reinforces his negative view of the world. For inmates like Ibarra, the lack of proper mental health support and rehabilitation means that many, like him, continue to languish in prison, caught in a cycle of unresolved emotional turmoil. The failure to address the psychological needs of individuals like Ibarra, those with a combination of untreated mental health issues and a history of violence, remains a significant flaw in the criminal justice system. Ibarra's inability to engage in therapy and his lack of willingness to participate in rehabilitation programs show just how difficult it can be for the system to help those who resist change. His case is not an isolated one, and many in the system face similar struggles, unable to escape their own cycles of violence and self-doubt. Public perception, Ibarra's legacy. As the years go by, Ibarra has become a symbol of both personal failure and systemic neglect. To the public, he remains the cold-blooded killer who ended a young woman's life. The details of his crime, his lack of remorse, the coldness with which he stalked his victim, and the brutality of his attack, are seared into the minds of the community, and any attempts at redemption are met with skepticism. For Laken's family, the idea of Ibarra's rehabilitation is an impossible one. While the public may debate his mental state or the fairness of his treatment in prison, Laken's parents and loved ones have already moved beyond the courtroom. They have fought for justice, and the sentence of life without parole has given them some measure of closure, though nothing can fill the void left by the loss of their daughter. "We don't care if he ever changes," Maria Riley said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of years of grief. "He doesn't deserve forgiveness. What he did to Laken is something that can never be undone. I don't care if he finds himself in prison. He doesn't get to have that chance. He had his chance, and he threw it away the moment he decided to take our daughter's life." The public's view of Ibarra is rooted in this same belief. His crime is unforgivable, and no amount of reflection or therapy can ever change the fact that he ended an innocent woman's life. He remains, in the eyes of many, a symbol of senseless violence, a man who was unwilling to accept responsibility for his actions, and who will forever be defined by the murder he committed. Moving forward, Laken's legacy and the need for systemic change. While Ibarra's fate remains sealed in the prison system, the conversations about mental health and criminal justice continue to evolve. Laken's family has made it their mission to use their tragedy to advocate for better treatment of inmates with mental health issues, pushing for more comprehensive psychological care and early intervention for individuals at risk of violent behavior. The tragedy of Laken's death serves as a powerful reminder of the failures of a system that often ignores the emotional and psychological needs of individuals before they commit irreversible harm. For Ibarra, the years ahead are filled with uncertainty. He may continue to reflect on his past, writing letters or attending occasional therapy sessions, but it is unclear if he will ever come to terms with the enormity of his actions. In the end, his legacy will be defined by the tragedy he caused, a senseless act of violence that claimed the life of a bright young woman and left a lasting scar on her family, the community, and the criminal justice system. Ibarra's inability to engage in genuine remorse or make meaningful changes in his behavior serves as a harsh reminder that true rehabilitation is not just a matter of attending therapy or completing programs. It requires a fundamental shift in one's understanding of self, responsibility, and the consequences of one's actions, a shift that Ibarra has yet to make. Confronting the consequences, Ibarra's present state. Jose Antonio Ibarra's life behind bars has become one of relentless monotony and mental turmoil. Each day is a continuation of the last, as he lives in the confined space of his prison cell, separated from the general population for his own safety. Yet, in this solitude, Ibarra finds no peace, only the echo of his crime and a mind that can never escape the consequences of his actions. In solitary confinement, Ibarra spends most of his time in silence. His interactions with others are limited to brief conversations with prison staff or rare visits from his mother, who remains emotionally connected to him despite the incomprehensible loss caused by his crime. Ibarra's mental health continues to deteriorate, though his situation is not unique. Many inmates with untreated emotional trauma, like Ibarra, remain stuck in a cycle of despair, with no avenue to break free from the emotional prison that holds them. He has been afforded opportunities for psychological counseling, but his engagement with these services is lackluster at best. During therapy sessions with prison psychologists, Ibarra acknowledges the violence of his actions, but struggles to connect emotionally with the gravity of his crime. His expressions of regret are often shallow, more self-focused than truly remorseful. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Ibarra says in one session, a statement he repeats with increasing frequency. "But it was like something inside me snapped, and I couldn't control it anymore." Even now, years after the murder of Laken Riley, he cannot fully understand the impact of what he did. The realization that his actions have permanently destroyed lives, including his own, eludes him. Instead, he remains fixated on his own personal history, on his pain, on his isolation, and on the series of unfortunate circumstances he believes led him to that moment of violence. Ibarra continues to write letters, mostly to his family, but sometimes to himself. These letters are an attempt to make sense of his present state and his role in the murder. "I know what I did was wrong," he writes in one letter, "but I don't know how to live with it. I can't undo it. I wish I could, but I can't. I feel like I'm just waiting for it all to be over." This resignation is part of Ibarra's reality now, an acceptance that he is trapped in a cycle from which there is no escape. His desire for redemption has been muted by his ongoing emotional paralysis. He knows he will never walk free again, but it is not the prison walls that keep him confined. It is the prison of his own mind. A fragile reflection, Ibarra's struggle with responsibility. Though Ibarra occasionally shows signs of self-awareness, these moments are fleeting. There are rare instances where he speaks about the murder with the gravity it deserves, but these moments often feel disconnected from the reality of his situation. His reflections lack the depth of true remorse and accountability. "I can't undo what I've done," he writes in another letter. "But I don't know how to fix myself either. I never had the right tools, and I never had the right guidance. I was lost before I even got here." While these admissions might seem like a step toward personal growth, they remain rooted in Ibarra's sense of victimhood. He is still unable to accept full responsibility for the murder of Laken Riley. Instead of confronting the pain he caused others, he fixates on his own sense of being lost, a man who believes he was always doomed to failure. He still refuses to see that it was his choices, his decision to murder an innocent woman, that defined his fate. The process of confronting his guilt is one that Ibarra resists. In a therapy session, when asked directly about Laken's family, he responds with a mixture of guilt and deflection. "I know I've hurt people I don't even know, but I don't know how to make it right. They'll never forgive me. No one will." This refusal to fully face the impact of his actions speaks to Ibarra's psychological limitations. While he acknowledges the consequences of his crime, he refuses to embrace the responsibility for his role in it. The emotional wall he has built to shield himself from the full weight of his guilt is unyielding. The long road to redemption, the limits of change. Ibarra's path to redemption, if such a path exists, remains obstructed by his inability to genuinely engage with the process of self-improvement. Though he has been given the opportunity to participate in various rehabilitative programs, his lack of emotional engagement with these resources limits their effectiveness. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, group therapy, and individual counseling have all been offered, but Ibarra's refusal to confront the true nature of his crime and the reasons behind it means that any progress he makes is minimal at best. "I've been given a lot of chances to change," he writes in a letter to his mother, "but I can't change who I am. I can't change what happened. All I can do now is wait. Wait for the time to pass. Wait for the day when this is over." His words are the words of a man who has surrendered, not to justice, but to his own emotional defeat. Ibarra seems to have given up on the possibility of change. Instead, he has accepted the consequences of his actions without truly reckoning with the full scope of their impact. Prison psychologists note that this attitude is common among long-term inmates who have spent years in solitary confinement. The isolation creates a mental landscape where emotional and psychological growth is stunted, leading many to succumb to apathy or denial. For Ibarra, the real punishment has become the mental prison he has built for himself, a place where he can no longer distinguish between what he has done and who he has become. The legacy of his crime, the impact on Laken's family. While Ibarra's time in prison is consumed with internal conflict, Laken's family continues to grapple with the emotional aftermath of her death. Though they have found a measure of justice in his conviction, the absence of Laken from their lives is a wound that will never heal. The years since the trial have been marked by an ongoing process of mourning, advocacy, and resilience, but the hole left by Laken's death is something they carry with them every day. Maria and John Riley, Laken's parents, remain committed to honoring their daughter's memory, but they continue to feel the weight of the loss. In interviews, they frequently speak about the need for change within the criminal justice system, especially regarding the mental health of inmates, but their words are never about forgiveness for Ibarra. For them, the question of his redemption is irrelevant. "He can sit in his cell and think about what he did all he wants," Maria Riley said in a recent interview. "But he'll never truly understand the depth of the pain he caused. And he'll never bring Laken back. He doesn't deserve forgiveness. What he did to us, to our family, there's no coming back from that." Their focus remains on ensuring that Laken's legacy lives on in a positive way. The scholarships they have established in her name continue to help students pursuing nursing careers, and their advocacy for mental health reform in the criminal justice system remains strong. But for them, the journey is one of remembrance, not reconciliation. Ibarra's legacy will always be defined by his crime. No matter how many letters he writes or how many years he spends in reflection, the fact remains that he took an innocent life, and that the impact of his actions extends far beyond the prison walls. He will forever be known as the man who killed Laken Riley, a woman with a promising future who was brutally taken from her family and the world. His attempts at self-reflection, though frequent, have not led him to true redemption. His inability to take full responsibility for his actions, his fixation on his own suffering, and his refusal to engage in meaningful rehabilitation have ensured that his time in prison remains a cycle of self-pity and denial. While Ibarra may spend the rest of his life in contemplation, it is unlikely that he will ever break free from the emotional prison he has created for himself. In the end, Ibarra's story is a tragic one, not because of the circumstances that led him to murder, but because of his inability to truly confront and understand the depth of his crime. His life is defined by a moment of violence, and the toll of that moment will echo through the rest of his existence. Rusty's reflection, the truth behind the shadows. As I sit back and reflect on the tragic tale of Jose Antonio Ibarra, I'm struck by how often the true story behind a crime is lost in the noise of headlines and media frenzy. People want to understand why something like this happens, why an innocent life is taken, but all too often, we look for answers in places that only deepen our confusion. The truth isn't always clear, and sometimes the answers we seek lie in the shadows, far from what is immediately visible. In the case of Ibarra, it's easy to fall into the trap of seeing him as a monster, a man who committed an unimaginable act of violence. But the reality is far more complex. He was a product of a broken system, a victim of his own psychological struggles, yet he still made the choice to take Laken Riley's life. This duality is something that we all must grapple with, as it's never just one factor that leads to a tragedy. It's a web of influences: mental health, societal rejection, personal failings, and moments of impulsive rage. Understanding this doesn't excuse the crime, but it does offer us a glimpse into the human condition, and it's this understanding that can sometimes prevent future tragedies. What strikes me the most, though, is the failure of the system to address these complex issues early on. Ibarra's case should be a wake-up call for us all. We cannot continue to overlook mental health and the consequences of emotional neglect in the criminal justice system. Too many lives are affected, both victims and perpetrators, when we fail to act. It's easy to get lost in the anger, to demand retribution without ever questioning how we got here. But the question that's often left unasked is, what can we do to prevent this from happening again? How can we fix the system so that we can address the root causes of violence before it erupts into something irreparable? As an amateur detective, I've spent years seeking the truth, often in places where others wouldn't look. And in this case, the truth isn't just about a killer being caught or a conviction being made. It's about understanding how and why something so senseless could happen. The more we understand, the better equipped we are to prevent it. But that begins with action. That's why I created Truth in the Shadows. I want to uncover the hidden truths, the ones that society often ignores. I want to bring light to the darkness, so we can understand the stories behind the headlines and maybe stop them from repeating. But I need your help. I need you to join me in this journey. By subscribing to Truth in the Shadows, you'll be part of a community that demands more than just sensational stories. We're looking for the truth. And the truth, as we've seen, often requires a closer look. If you're passionate about uncovering the real story behind the crimes that shape our world, if you want to know more than what's reported, and if you believe in the power of knowledge to make change, I encourage you to subscribe to Truth in the Shadows. Let's shine a light on what others choose to ignore. Together, we can start asking the right questions and demand a system that seeks to understand, not just punish.